June 14, 1943, 8,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly on the cockpit canopy of First Lieutenant James Harrison's Curtiss P-40 Warhawk as he scanned the vast Pacific horizon. Intelligence had reported Japanese Zero fighters patrolling this sector, but so far the sky remained empty save for scattered clouds. Harrison smiled grimly to himself. The Japanese pilots had no idea what was coming their way. They expected to encounter the same American pilots they had been fighting for months. They certainly did not expect to face black men in the cockpits of those American fighters. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a group of black American pilots would not only shatter the Japanese expectations of aerial combat, but fundamentally transform American military policy, international perceptions of African American capabilities, and ultimately contribute to the dismantling of segregation in the United States. Lieutenant Harrison checked his formation one more time. 5 other P-40 Warhawks flew in tight coordination, each piloted by a graduate of the experimental program known as the Tuskegee Airmen. To his right flew Lieutenant Marcus Williams, a former college mathematics professor from Philadelphia. Behind him was Lieutenant Thomas Jenkins, once a car mechanic from Detroit, who could diagnose engine troubles just by listening. Lieutenant Robert Lawson, a preacher's son from Georgia, flew on the left flank. Lieutenant Frederick Thompson, a former Howard University track star, and Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, who had worked as a civilian pilot before the war, completed the formation. Red 6 to Red Leader. I've got contacts at 2 o'clock high. Lieutenant Brooks called over the radio, his voice calm but tense. Looks like 9 aircraft approaching from the direction of Rabaul. Harrison instinctively tightened his grip on the control stick. Roger that, Red 6. All planes, prepare to engage. Remember your training, stay together, watch each other's tails. And don't try to dogfight these Zeros one-on-one. They're more maneuverable, but we've got better armor and diving speed. In the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, Flight Lieutenant Takeo Yoshida felt confident as he led his 8 wingmen toward the American patrol. At 26 years old, Yoshida was already considered a veteran, with 17 confirmed kills against American aircraft. The Zero fighter he piloted was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, lightweight, exceptionally maneuverable, and with a remarkable range of 1,850 miles, more than double that of most American fighters. American fighters approaching, Yoshida informed his squadron in Japanese. Prepare to engage. Remember, they will likely attempt to dive away. Cut them off and force them to maneuver. Their planes cannot match our turning ability. Yoshida had studied American tactics extensively. The American pilots typically relied on their aircraft's superior power and diving speed, making slashing attacks before withdrawing to safety. They rarely engaged in prolonged turning battles where the Zero excelled. What Yoshida could not know, however, was that today's opponents had developed entirely new tactics specifically to counter the Zero's advantages. As the distance closed between the two formations, Lieutenant Harrison gave the command, "Red Squadron, execute Scissors Defense, now." In an instant, the American formation transformed. Instead of breaking apart as Japanese pilots expected, the P-40s paired off, each duo flying in a weaving pattern that made it impossible for a pursuer to target either aircraft without becoming vulnerable to the other. This tactic, developed through hundreds of hours of training specifically to counter the Zero, had never been seen before in the Pacific theater. Yoshida's eyes widened as he watched the unusual American formation. "They're using different tactics," he radioed to his squadron. "Be cautious." The first pass happened in seconds. Tracer fire cut through the sky as both formations merged and separated. One Zero trailed smoke from its engine, the pilot struggling to maintain control. Lieutenant Williams' voice crackled over Harrison's radio. "Red 2 to Red Leader. I scored hits on one Zero, but another one is on my tail. Red 3 moving to assist." Jenkins responded immediately. The battle quickly expanded across 3 dimensions of sky. The American pilots executed their coordinated tactics with precision that shocked the Japanese squadron. When a Zero latched onto an American fighter's tail, another P-40 would swoop down, forcing the Japanese pilot to break off or face destruction. Lieutenant Lawson's voice suddenly filled the radio channel. "I've got one on me that I can't shake." Harrison banked hard, spotting Lawson's predicament. A Zero had managed to get on his tail, despite the defensive tactics. "Hold on, Red 4. I'm coming around." Yoshida watched with growing concern as the American fighters demonstrated unexpected coordination and discipline. These were not the same tactics he had encountered before. His squadron, trained to exploit the individualistic tendencies of American pilots, found themselves outmaneuvered by this cohesive unit. The American lieutenant named Lawson executed a desperate maneuver, cutting his throttle momentarily and dropping his landing flaps. The sudden decrease in speed forced his Japanese pursuer to overshoot. In that brief moment of advantage, Lawson fired a burst that tore into the Zero's lightweight structure. The Japanese aircraft rolled over and began spiraling toward the ocean far below. "Red 4 to all units," Lawson called, his voice betraying both relief and exhilaration. Tally 1. From his vantage point, Yoshida realized that this engagement was fundamentally different. The American pilots were flying with a level of coordination he had never witnessed before. They protected each other, anticipated threats, and struck with surprising effectiveness. 20,000 miles away in the state of Alabama, Chief Flight Instructor Charles Alfred watched as another class of cadets practiced formation, flying at Moton Field. The Tuskegee Army Airfield program had begun as what many white military leaders expected to be a failed experiment, an opportunity to prove that black men lacked the necessary qualities to become military pilots. Alfred, one of the program's first instructors, knew better. "Tighter formation, Johnson," he called through a megaphone as the training aircraft passed overhead. "Richards, watch your altitude." The instructors at Tuskegee pushed their cadets harder than any other training program in the United States. They knew that for black pilots to succeed, they would need to be not just as good as their white counterparts, but demonstrably better. Every graduate of the program carried this understanding with them to combat. Back in the skies above the Solomon Islands, the battle had shifted decisively. 3 Japanese Zeros had been damaged or destroyed, while the American formation remained intact, though not unscathed. Lieutenant Thompson's aircraft had taken hits to the wing, and Jenkins was reporting engine troubles. "Red leader to all units," Harrison called. "We've made our point. Let's disengage and head for home base." As the American fighters turned westward, Lieutenant Yoshida faced a critical decision. Military doctrine and personal honor demanded he pursue the retreating enemy, but tactical wisdom suggested otherwise. These American pilots had demonstrated capabilities that defied his expectations. With several of his own aircraft damaged and his formation disrupted, pursuing them could lead to further losses. "All units, we are returning to base," he finally ordered, a decision that would later require substantial explanation to his superiors. As Harrison led his squadron back toward their base on Guadalcanal, he reflected on the significance of what they had just accomplished. This had been more than just another aerial engagement. It represented the first combat test of everything the Tuskegee program stood for. 3 weeks earlier, Lieutenant General Richard Miller had summoned Harrison to headquarters. A career officer with traditional views, Miller had initially opposed the deployment of black pilots to the Pacific Theater. "Lieutenant, I'm sending your squadron to the Solomons," Miller had stated without preamble. "This is not my decision, you understand. Orders from higher up." Harrison had stood at attention, his expression neutral despite the significance of the moment. "Yes, sir. We are prepared for combat operations." Miller had studied him skeptically. "Are you—" "The Japanese pilots you'll be facing have years of experience. Many were flying combat missions in China while you were still trying to convince the army to let you into a cockpit." "With respect, sir, my men have completed all required training with scores that exceed standard requirements," Harrison had responded. "We've studied Japanese tactics extensively and developed counters specifically for the Zero fighter." "Training is not combat, Lieutenant," Miller had said, leaning back in his chair. "The Japanese Zero has a 360-degree turning radius, nearly 40% tighter than your P-40s. Their pilots are raised from childhood to believe death in service of their emperor is the highest honor. What do you have that can counter that?" Harrison had paused before answering. "Ingenuity, sir. And something to prove." now. As his squadron approached Guadalcanal with their first combat victory secured, Harrison knew this was only the beginning. Word would spread quickly about black pilots successfully engaging and defeating the feared Japanese Zeros. But he also knew that one victory would not be enough to change entrenched attitudes. Back at base, Squadron Commander Colonel William Roberts awaited their return with mixed emotions. Roberts had commanded white fighter squadrons in Europe before being assigned to oversee this experimental black unit, an assignment he had initially considered a demotion. As the P-40s landed one by one, Roberts counted them with visible relief. All 6 had returned. Several showed signs of combat damage, but they had all made it back, an outcome that exceeded his cautious expectations. "Lieutenant Harrison," Roberts called as the squadron leader climbed down from his cockpit. "Report." Harrison saluted crisply. "Sir, we engaged 9 Japanese Zeros approximately 100 miles northeast of our position. We confirmed 3 enemy aircraft destroyed and 2 more damaged. We sustained damage to 2 of our aircraft, but no casualties." Roberts' expression remained professional, but Harrison detected a hint of surprise. "Excellent work, Lieutenant. Have your men prepare detailed action reports. I want to know exactly what tactics you employed." "Yes, sir," Harrison replied. "If I may say so, sir, the scissor defense maneuvers we developed specifically worked effectively against the Zeros' turning advantage." Roberts nodded thoughtfully. "I'll want to review those tactics personally. They might be valuable for other squadrons." This subtle acknowledgement that white squadrons might learn from tactics developed by black pilots represented a small but significant shift. It was the beginning of a transformation that would accelerate in the coming months. In Tokyo, at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, Intelligence Officer Commander Hideki Nakamura reviewed the combat reports from the Solomon Islands with growing concern. The initial encounters with American fighters in 1942 had confirmed Japanese superiority in air combat. Their pilots were better trained, more experienced, and flew superior aircraft. The early months of the war had seen Japanese pilots achieve kill ratios of nearly 10-to-1 against American forces. But recent reports showed troubling trends. American pilots were adapting, developing new tactics, and their newer aircraft were beginning to negate some of the Zeros' advantages. This latest report from Lieutenant Yoshida described American pilots using coordinated defensive formations that effectively countered the Zeros' maneuverability advantage. "Have we identified the American unit involved in this engagement?" Nakamura asked his aide. "Yes, Commander. Based on the aircraft markings, they appear to be from one of the new squadrons recently deployed to the Pacific. Our intelligence suggests these may be from the special American unit composed of Negro pilots." Nakamura raised an eyebrow. Japanese intelligence had noted the American military's racial segregation policies with interest, considering it a strategic weakness that divided their fighting forces. The deployment of black pilots represented an unexpected development. "Are these Negro pilots proving effective?" he asked. "The limited data suggests they are performing at least as well as other American units, possibly better in some metrics. They appear to be employing innovative tactical formations specifically designed to counter our Zeros." Nakamura made a note in his report. This development warranted closer monitoring. If the Americans were beginning to utilize previously marginalized segments of their population more effectively, it could represent a significant shift in the war's trajectory. At Tuskegee Army Airfield, Colonel Noel Howard, the base commander, received the combat report from the Pacific with a complex mixture of pride and vindication. Howard had fought countless political battles to establish and maintain the Tuskegee program against persistent opposition from military leaders who insisted that black men lacked the intelligence, reflexes, and courage to become combat pilots. "They said it couldn't be done, Jackson," Howard remarked to his executive officer, Major William Jackson. "They said black men couldn't fly combat aircraft, couldn't face the enemy, couldn't perform under pressure." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied. "Those first graduates are proving them wrong." Howard nodded, studying the report again. 3 confirmed kills against Japanese Zeros with no losses. That's better than most experienced squadrons manage in their first engagement. He looked up at Jackson. "Make sure every instructor gets a copy of this report. I want every cadet to understand what their predecessors have accomplished and what will be expected of them." The success of Harrison's squadron would have implications far beyond that single engagement. For the cadets still training at Tuskegee, it provided powerful validation and motivation. For military leaders still skeptical of black aviators, it presented facts that challenged their preconceptions. And for the American public, once the story eventually reached the newspapers back home, it would begin to reshape perceptions about black military service. Lieutenant Marcus Williams sat alone in the squadron's ready room late that evening, writing a letter to his wife, Eleanor, a mathematics teacher at a segregated school in Philadelphia. "Today we face the feared Japanese Zero fighters," he wrote, "the same aircraft that have dominated the skies since Pearl Harbor. We engaged them using the tactics we developed during all those extra hours of training. And Eleanor, we prevailed. I wish I could adequately describe what this means, not just for us as pilots, but for everyone back home who never believed we would get this chance, and for all those who fought to ensure we did." Williams paused, considering how much to share about the broader significance of their achievement. Eleanor would understand. She had always seen the Tuskegee program as part of the larger struggle for equality and recognition. "The Japanese pilots never expected to face black Americans in combat," he continued. "They certainly never expected us to outfly their vaunted Zeros, but today we changed everything, not just the tactical situation in this theater, but perhaps in some small way perceptions back home as well. Each victory here represents another crack in the foundation of segregation that has limited our people for so long." Lieutenant Yoshida sat in the officers' quarters of the Japanese airbase at Rabaul, completing his own combat report. Military discipline required complete honesty. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed accurate assessments to maintain tactical superiority. Yet Yoshida struggled to explain how his experienced squadron had been outmaneuvered by American pilots. The American formation employed coordinated defensive tactics unlike previous encounters, he wrote. Their pilots demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and mutual support that negated our maneuverability advantage. Future engagements with this American unit will require revised tactical approaches. What Yoshida could not include in his official report were his personal reflections on the engagement. The Americans had fought with a determination and cohesion that suggested they were defending something beyond just territory or military objectives. He had sensed in their tactics a deeper purpose, as though they were fighting not just this battle but for recognition itself. 2 days later, Harrison's squadron received orders for another patrol mission. This time, they would venture even farther into contested airspace, escorting a reconnaissance aircraft photographing Japanese positions on Bougainville. Before takeoff, Harrison gathered his pilots for a briefing. "Gentlemen, yesterday we proved something to ourselves. Today we prove it wasn't a fluke. The reconnaissance aircraft we're escorting is piloted by a crew that's never flown with black escorts before. They're counting on us to bring them home safely, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Lieutenant Jenkins raised his hand. "Sir, intelligence reports at least 12 Zeros operating in that sector." Harrison nodded. "That's right. We'll be outnumbered, possibly 2 to 1. But we've trained for this. We know their tactics, and now they've had a taste of ours. They'll be more cautious, which we can use to our advantage." As the pilots dispersed to their aircraft, Lieutenant Thompson fell into step beside Harrison. "Sir, the crew of that reconnaissance plane, do they know who's escorting them?" Harrison gave him a knowing look. "They've been informed they'll have fighter escort from the 547th Fighter Squadron. Whether they know what makes the 547th special is another question." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Either way, they'll know by the time we bring them home." Meanwhile, at 5th Air Force Headquarters on Port Moresby, General Robert Stevens was reviewing the combat reports from all squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands theater. Stevens had initially opposed the deployment of black pilots to his command, arguing that introducing racial integration would complicate operations and undermine morale. "These reports from the 547th are impressive," observed Colonel James Morgan, his operations officer. 3 confirmed kills against Zeros in their first engagement, with no losses. Stevens frowned. "One successful engagement doesn't validate the entire program, Colonel." "Of course not, sir," Morgan agreed carefully. "But their success rate exceeds the average for new squadrons in this theater. And these tactical innovations they're employing against the Zero, the scissor defense formation, could be valuable for our other units. Stevens leaned back in his chair, considering. He was a pragmatist above all else. His primary concern was winning the air war in the Pacific, and that required making optimal use of all available resources. If black pilots could contribute effectively to that goal, his personal reservations about racial integration became secondary. Have the 547th document their tactical approach in detail, Stevens finally ordered. Distribute it to all fighter squadrons in the theater for evaluation and potential implementation. This order represented a significant shift. Tactics developed by black pilots would now be taught to white squadrons throughout the Pacific. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the Tuskegee Airmen had something valuable to contribute to the broader war effort. The reconnaissance mission proceeded into enemy airspace with tense anticipation. Captain Richard Werner, pilot of the F-5 reconnaissance aircraft, had indeed been surprised to learn that his escort would be provided by the new black squadron he had heard rumors about. Like many white officers, Werner harbored doubts about the capabilities of black pilots, shaped by the prevailing prejudices of American society. Keep your eyes open for our escort, Werner instructed his crew as they approached the rendezvous point. They should be meeting us at coordinates Charlie Delta 7. Right on schedule, 6 P-40 Warhawks appeared, taking up protective positions around the larger reconnaissance plane. "Reconnaissance aircraft, this is Red Leader," Harrison's voice came through the radio. "We'll be your escort to the target area and back. Maintain your current course and speed." Werner acknowledged the transmission professionally, but privately exchanged glances with his co-pilot. Their safety and the success of their critical mission now depended on the skills of pilots that many in the military establishment had deemed inherently inferior. The formation proceeded deeper into contested airspace, approaching Bougainville Island, where Japanese installations needed to be photographed for upcoming operation planning. The tension in all cockpits increased with each mile. Lieutenant Lawson was the first to spot the approaching threat. "Red Leader, we have multiple bogies approaching from the northwest, Angels 15. The term Angels 15 indicated the enemy aircraft were at 15,000 feet altitude. Harrison immediately assessed the situation. "Reconnaissance aircraft, continue on mission profile. Red Squadron, prepare to engage. Remember, our primary objective is ensuring the reconnaissance mission succeeds. Defensive posture only until the photography is complete." The Japanese formation, led once again by Lieutenant Yoshida, had been specifically tasked with intercepting this American reconnaissance mission. Intelligence had identified the photography mission as a precursor to a potential American offensive, making it a high-priority target. Yoshida recognized the same American fighters his squadron had engaged 2 days earlier. "It's the same unit," he informed his pilots. "They will use coordinated defensive tactics. We will counter with dispersed attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously." What followed was an aerial chess match at 400 miles per hour. The Japanese fighters attempted to break through to the vulnerable reconnaissance aircraft, while Harrison's squadron maintained a protective screen. Each time a Zero would find an approach vector, IP-40 would move to intercept, forcing the Japanese pilot to break off or risk collision. Inside the reconnaissance aircraft, Captain Werner and his crew watched the unfolding battle with growing admiration. The black pilots they had quietly doubted were now putting their lives at risk, with extraordinary skill to ensure the reconnaissance mission could complete its objective. "They're good," Werner's navigator commented as they watched a P-40 drive off a Zero that had nearly reached their aircraft. "Damn good," Werner nodded, his preconceptions rapidly dissolving in the face of observed reality. "Begin photography sequence," he ordered. "Let's make sure their efforts aren't wasted." The aerial battle intensified as the reconnaissance aircraft began its photography run. Japanese fighters pressed their attacks with increasing aggression, recognizing the critical phase of the mission. Lieutenant Thompson's aircraft took heavy damage while intercepting a Zero that had broken through their defensive screen. "Red 6 is hit," Lieutenant Brooks called out. "Thompson, what's your status?" Thompson's voice came through with static interference. "Controls sluggish but responsive. I can maintain flight, staying in formation." Despite his damaged aircraft, Thompson remained in position, continuing to contribute to the squadron's defensive screen. This level of determination and unit cohesion impressed even Yoshida, who found his squadron increasingly frustrated by their inability to reach the reconnaissance aircraft. "Photography sequence complete," Werner finally announced. "Beginning egress route Delta." Harrison acknowledged, "Roger that. Red Squadron, maintain defensive screen during egress. Thompson, take position at the rear. Brooks, cover him." As the formation turned back toward friendly territory, Yoshida faced the same decision point as in their previous engagement. His squadron had failed to prevent the reconnaissance mission, and continuing the pursuit would only lead to diminishing returns as they approached American-controlled airspace. "All units, break off engagement," he ordered reluctantly. "Return to base." As the Japanese fighters disappeared from the radar, a palpable sense of achievement spread through the American formation. Not only had they successfully protected the reconnaissance aircraft, but they had done so against superior numbers without losing a single plane. Captain Werner landed his reconnaissance aircraft at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with a new perspective on the black pilots who had ensured his mission's success. As ground crews rushed to retrieve the valuable reconnaissance photographs, Werner made his way directly to Colonel Roberts' office, still in his flight gear. "Colonel, I want to formally commend the escort squadron," Werner stated as he entered. "Their performance was exemplary under extremely challenging circumstances." Roberts looked up from his paperwork with mild surprise. "I understand they performed their duties adequately, Captain." "With respect, sir." "Adequately doesn't begin to describe it," Werner countered. "They faced superior numbers of Japan's best fighters and didn't just protect my aircraft, they prevented any enemy from getting within effective firing range." Lieutenant Thompson continued flying effectively, despite significant damage to his aircraft. "I've flown with many escort groups, sir, and I've never seen better." Roberts studied Werner thoughtfully. As a career military officer, Roberts had absorbed the prevailing institutional skepticism about black aviators, yet the mounting evidence of their effectiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. "I'll note your commendation in my report to headquarters," Roberts finally responded. "Your photographs may prove crucial for upcoming operations." Later that evening, as Lieutenant Harrison's squadron gathered in their quarters, a messenger arrived with sealed orders. Harrison opened them while his pilots waited expectantly. "Gentlemen," he announced after reading the contents, "based on our performance in recent engagements, we're being assigned to lead escort duties for the upcoming bombing mission to Rabaul." A moment of silence followed as the significance of this assignment registered. Rabaul was the main Japanese base in the region, heavily defended and considered one of the most dangerous targets in the South Pacific. Lead escort duty meant Harrison's squadron would be responsible for protecting not just a single reconnaissance aircraft, but an entire formation of vulnerable bombers. "They're trusting us with their most valuable assets," Lieutenant Williams observed quietly. Harrison nodded. "This isn't just another mission. This is a statement about what they think we're capable of." Across the Pacific at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Commander Nakamura presented his analysis to a group of senior officers, including Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. "The Americans are deploying new fighter units with unexpected effectiveness," Nakamura explained, pointing to combat reports compiled from multiple encounters. "Particularly notable is this unit operating from Guadalcanal, which has demonstrated superior tactical coordination." Vice Admiral Kurita frowned. "You mentioned these are Negro pilots. How is this possible when American military policy has historically restricted such personnel to support roles?" "It appears to be an experimental program, Admiral," Nakamura responded. "Our intelligence indicates it began as a limited test under political pressure from American civil rights organizations. However, their combat performance suggests the experiment has yielded unexpected results." Kurita considered this information carefully. The Japanese military had studied American society extensively before the war, noting its racial divisions as a potential vulnerability. The emergence of effective black combat units represented an unforeseen development. If the Americans are now effectively utilizing previously marginalized portions of their population, Kurita observed, This could significantly impact their military capacity. We must adjust our strategic planning accordingly. This assessment would prove prophetic. The American military was indeed beginning a transformation that would eventually extend far beyond a single squadron of black pilots. At the 5th Air Force headquarters, General Stevens reviewed the operational plans for the upcoming Rabaul mission with his staff. The 547th Fighter Squadron will provide lead escort for the bomber formation, Colonel Morgan informed the assembly, pointing to the tactical map. Major Gregory Wilson, the Air Operations Planner, looked up in surprise. "Sir, is that the colored squadron? Are we certain they're ready for such a critical assignment?" Stevens fixed Wilson with a level gaze. "Major, that squadron has now flown 7 combat missions with a success rate of 100%. They've developed tactical formations specifically effective against Zero fighters, which they've documented and distributed throughout the command. Their engagement statistics now lead all fighter groups in this theater. So yes, Major, I'm certain they're ready." The room fell silent. Stevens had been among the officers most skeptical of integrating black pilots into combat roles. His endorsement now, based purely on performance metrics, represented a significant institutional shift. "The mission will proceed as planned," Stevens concluded. "The 547th will lead escort, with the 23rd and 38th providing secondary coverage." This decision meant that white fighter squadrons would effectively be operating under the tactical leadership of black pilots, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable mere months earlier. The night before the Rabaul mission, Lieutenant Yoshida received new intelligence briefings at the Japanese base. American bombing raids were expected, and his squadron would be among those defending this critical installation. "Recent intelligence indicates the Americans will be employing their new Negro fighter squadron as escort," the briefing officer informed them. "Based on previous encounters, we must expect coordinated defensive tactics designed to counter our maneuverability advantage." Yoshida had developed a grudging respect for the American pilots he had faced twice before. Their tactical discipline had proven surprisingly effective. Now, knowing they would be defending a large bomber formation rather than a single reconnaissance aircraft, he anticipated an even greater challenge. "We will focus on breaking their formations," Yoshida told his pilots. "Once separated, their coordination advantage diminishes. Target their squadron leaders first to disrupt command coherence." This tactical adjustment reflected a significant shift. Japanese forces were now specifically planning countermeasures against the unique capabilities demonstrated by the Tuskegee Airmen. It was, perhaps ironically, a form of respect. The morning of the Rabaul mission dawned with low clouds and scattered rain showers, challenging but acceptable flying conditions. In the briefing room at Henderson Field, bomber crews and fighter pilots reviewed the mission parameters together. Major Howard Phillips, commander of the bomber group, addressed the assembled airmen. "Gentlemen, today's target is the port facilities at Rabaul. Intelligence estimates approximately 30 enemy fighters will respond to our approach. Our success depends on maintaining tight formation to maximize defensive firepower and accurate bombing runs." Phillips then turned toward Harrison and his pilots. "The 547th will provide lead escort, establishing a defensive screen above and ahead of the bomber formation. Based on their previous engagements with Japanese fighters, they have developed specific counters to Zero tactics that have proven effective. Lieutenant Harrison will coordinate all fighter response during the mission." Several of the white pilots exchanged glances. While most had heard rumors about the Black Squadron's growing reputation, this formal acknowledgement of their tactical leadership represented unfamiliar territory. Captain Martin Reynolds, a fighter pilot from the 23rd Squadron, approached Harrison after the briefing. "Lieutenant, we've studied your squadron's tactical document on countering Zero fighters. Impressive work." Harrison nodded. "Thank you, Captain. We developed those approaches through intensive analysis of Japanese capabilities and testing various counters in training." Reynolds hesitated before continuing. "Some of my pilots have expressed concerns about following tactical direction from your squadron." "I understand," Harrison replied carefully. "Perhaps you could remind them that in combat, what matters is competence, not color. We all bleed the same red when we're hit." Reynolds considered this, then extended his hand. "We'll follow your lead up there, Lieutenant. Bring us all home." This brief exchange represented a microcosm of the larger transformation underway, professional respect beginning to transcend entrenched prejudice through shared danger and demonstrated capability. As the massive formation of aircraft approached Rabaul, 12 B-17 flying fortresses, protected by 3 squadrons of fighters, Japanese radar operators alerted their defense forces. Lieutenant Yoshida led his squadron to intercept, along with pilots from 2 other Japanese units. From his position at the point of the escort formation, Lieutenant Harrison watched the radar contacts multiplying ahead. "All fighter units, this is Red Leader. Enemy interceptors approaching in force. Execute dispersed defense pattern Alpha. 23rd Squadron take high cover. 38th take flanking positions. Red Squadron will maintain close escort." The plan distributed American fighters in layers around the bomber formation, creating a defense in depth that would force Japanese interceptors to navigate multiple screens of fighters to reach their targets. Lieutenant Yoshida immediately recognized the sophisticated defensive arrangement. "They're using a multi-layered defense," he radioed to the other Japanese squadron leaders. "We must coordinate our approach vectors." What followed was the largest and most complex aerial battle yet fought between these opposing forces. Japanese Zeros attacked from multiple directions, attempting to find seams in the American defensive screen. The American fighters responded with disciplined coordination, shifting resources to threatened sectors while maintaining the integrity of their overall formation. Lieutenant Jenkins found himself engaged with 2 Zeros simultaneously, using the P-40's superior diving speed to evade their turning advantage, then climbing back to regain position. Lieutenant Lawson executed a perfect deflection shot against a Zero, attempting to penetrate the screen, sending the Japanese fighter spiraling away, trailing smoke. In the lead bomber, Major Phillips watched the unfolding battle with professional appreciation. "Those Tuskegee boys really know what they're doing," he remarked to his co-pilot. "They're keeping the Zeros completely occupied while we maintain course to target." The most crucial moment came when a group of 7 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Yoshida himself, coordinated a simultaneous attack from different vectors, attempting to overwhelm a section of the defensive screen. Harrison recognized the tactic immediately. "Red Squadron, execute scattered response," he ordered. "Williams and Jenkins, vector northeast. Lawson and Brooks, vector northwest. Thompson, stay with me." This countermeasure, practiced extensively during training, dispersed the American fighters in a pattern specifically designed to intercept multiple simultaneous attacks. Rather than maintaining a fixed screen that could be overwhelmed, the formation became dynamic, with each fighter operating in a designated sector, but responding flexibly to threats within that sector. Yoshida's coordinated attack faltered as each of his aircraft encountered an American fighter positioned precisely to intercept their approach vector. What should have created a momentary numerical advantage instead resulted in a series of one-on-one engagements where the Japanese pilots could not utilize their preferred tactics. "Their coordination is extraordinary," Yoshida radioed to his wingman. "Fall back and regroup for another approach." By the time the Japanese fighters had reorganized, the American bombers had reached their target area and begun their bombing runs. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around the bomber formation, but the precisely planned defensive screen kept enemy fighters at bay during this most vulnerable phase of the mission. "Bombs away," Phillips announced as his bomber group released their payloads over the Rabaul port facilities. "Beginning egress pattern now." The return journey proved equally challenging, as Japanese fighters made desperate attempts to exact revenge for the damage to their base. Yet the American formation maintained its discipline, with Harrison's squadron continuing to coordinate the overall defense. When the formation finally returned to Henderson Field, all 12 bombers had survived, though several had sustained damage from anti-aircraft fire. 3 American fighters had been lost, 1 each from the 23rd and 38th Squadrons, and Lieutenant Thompson from the 547th, who had sacrificed his aircraft to protect a damaged bomber. As the pilots gathered for debriefing, Captain Reynolds approached Harrison again. "Your man Thompson saved one of our bombers," he said quietly. "That kind of courage, it transcends everything else." Harrison nodded solemnly. Thompson was a Howard University track star before the war, could have gone to the Olympics if they hadn't been cancelled. He always said flying was just another kind of race. He won this one, Reynolds replied. We all did. The success of the Rabaul mission accelerated the transformation already underway. The after-action reports highlighted the effectiveness of the tactical approach developed by the Tuskegee Airmen, and their coordination role in the mission's success was specifically noted. Back in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, reviewed these reports with growing interest. Arnold had initially harbored the same doubts as many military leaders about the capabilities of black pilots, but he was fundamentally a pragmatist concerned with winning the war through optimal utilization of all available resources. These reports from the Pacific are quite remarkable, Arnold observed to General Walter Smith, his chief of personnel. The 547th is consistently outperforming other fighter groups in almost every metric we track. Smith nodded cautiously. They've developed some innovative tactical approaches specifically for countering Japanese fighters. General Stevens reports these are now being implemented across all fighter groups in the theater. Arnold tapped the folder thoughtfully. When we authorized this program, many considered it merely a political concession that would have minimal military value. These results suggest otherwise. What are you proposing, sir? Smith asked. Expansion, Arnold replied decisively. If the existing squadron is performing this effectively, we should establish additional ones. The war demands we utilize every advantage available to us. This decision would eventually lead to the formation of the 332nd Fighter Group, comprising multiple squadrons of black pilots who would go on to distinguish themselves in the European theater as well as the Pacific. At Tuskegee Army Airfield, the success of Harrison's squadron created ripple effects throughout the training program. Colonel Howard called a special assembly of all cadets in training to share the combat reports. Gentlemen, what you are training for here is not symbolic, Howard told them. Your predecessors have proven beyond any doubt that black pilots can not only fly and fight effectively, but can excel in combat against the most formidable opponents. They have developed tactical innovations now being adopted throughout the air forces. They have changed everything, not just for you, but for the entire military. The cadets listened in rapt attention. For many, the Tuskegee program had represented their only opportunity to serve as pilots, despite qualifications equal to or exceeding those of white candidates admitted to standard training programs. Now they were hearing that their predecessors had not merely participated, but had fundamentally influenced American air combat doctrine. The bar has been set high, Howard concluded. These reports from the Pacific show what you are capable of achieving. The expectations have changed. You're no longer fighting just to be allowed to fight. You're now expected to excel, to innovate, to lead, and based on what I've seen in your training performance, you will. This transformation of expectations represented perhaps the most profound change of all. What had begun as an experiment to prove the presumed limitations of black aviators had instead demonstrated capabilities that challenged the very foundations of military segregation policies. At the Japanese base in Rabaul, partially damaged from the American bombing raid, Lieutenant Yoshida composed a comprehensive analysis of the air battle for his superiors. Military professionalism required honest assessment, even when the conclusions challenged existing assumptions. The American Negro pilots demonstrate exceptional tactical coordination and discipline, he wrote. Their defensive formations are specifically optimized to counter our maneuverability advantage, suggesting extensive analysis of our capabilities and methodical development of countermeasures. Future engagements will require significant tactical adaptation on our part. In his private journal, Yoshida added thoughts he could not include in an official report. Today I encountered pilots who flew with something beyond mere military obligation. They flew with the determination of men proving something essential about themselves. There is a lesson here about the power of motivated soldiers that our military would be wise to consider. This observation cut to the heart of what made the Tuskegee Airmen so effective. They flew with the combined weight of history on their shoulders, knowing that their performance would either reinforce or refute generations of prejudice. 6 months after the Rabaul mission, the situation in the Pacific Theater had evolved significantly. Additional squadrons of black pilots had been deployed, and the tactical innovations developed by Harrison's squadron had become standard doctrine for countering Japanese fighters. Perhaps most significantly, the rigid segregation that had initially characterized their deployment had begun to erode under the practical pressures of combat operations. At a planning conference for the Philippines campaign, Lieutenant Harrison, now Captain Harrison following his promotion, found himself integrated into the operational planning staff, alongside white officers of equal rank. The change had happened so gradually that its significance only occasionally registered. "Captain Harrison, your assessment of Japanese fighter response to our planned Luzon operations," requested Colonel James Morgan, now the head of Air Operations Planning. Harrison indicated several locations on the tactical map. "Based on previous patterns and current intelligence, we can expect concentrated resistance here and here. I recommend implementing our distributed defense formation with embedded flexible response teams to counter their likely attempt at coordinated multi-vector attacks." The other officers nodded in agreement. Harrison's tactical expertise was now accepted without question, a profound shift from the skepticism that had greeted the squadron's initial deployment. Later, General Stevens pulled Harrison aside after the briefing. "Captain, I've been authorized to inform you that your tactical manual on countering Zero fighters is being implemented across all theaters where our forces engage Japanese aircraft. The War Department considers it the definitive operational guide on the subject." Harrison absorbed this information with professional composure, but its implications were momentous. Tactics developed by black pilots were now literally writing the book on how the United States military conducted certain aspects of the air war. "Thank you for informing me, sir," Harrison replied. "The credit belongs to my entire squadron. We developed those approaches collaboratively." Stevens nodded. "That's been noted, which is why I'm also authorized to inform you that the program is being expanded significantly. 4 new squadrons of graduates from Tuskegee will be deployed to this theater within the next 3 months. This expansion represented institutional acknowledgement at the highest levels that the experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, except perhaps those of the pilots themselves, who had always known what they were capable of when given the opportunity. In the officers' club that evening, which had initially been segregated but was now informally integrated through the gradual erosion of barriers, Harrison shared the news with Captain Reynolds, whose initial reservations about serving alongside black pilots had long since dissolved. 4 new squadrons, Reynolds mused, sipping his drink. 2 years ago, the idea of even 1 was controversial. Harrison nodded. "Performance has a way of changing perspectives." "It's more than that," Reynolds countered. "You and your men changed the narrative. You didn't just perform well, you innovated, you excelled, you led. The Japanese never expected black American pilots to outfly their Zeros. Hell, most of our own military never expected it either. But you did, and in doing so, you changed everything." The transformation extended beyond military operations to influence American society more broadly. News of the Tuskegee Airmen's success gradually filtered back to the United States, where it contributed to the growing civil rights discourse. If black Americans could fight with distinction in the nation's most technically demanding military roles, how could their capabilities be questioned in civilian contexts? Eleanor Williams, Lieutenant Williams' wife, received his letters describing their achievements and shared them with her colleagues at the Philadelphia school where she taught. For her students in the segregated education system, these accounts provided powerful inspiration, concrete evidence that excellence could overcome artificial barriers. "My husband and his squadron have developed tactical approaches now being taught to all American pilots fighting in the Pacific," she told her mathematics class. "They analyzed the performance characteristics of Japanese aircraft, calculated their strengths and weaknesses, and developed geometric formations to counter them. This is applied mathematics at its most consequential. For students who had been told explicitly and implicitly that certain career paths were closed to them regardless of their abilities, this real-world example of black excellence in a technical field carried profound significance. As the war progressed, the Tuskegee Airmen continued to distinguish themselves in both the Pacific and European theaters. Their success became increasingly difficult to dismiss as exceptional or anomalous, forcing institutional reconsideration of segregation policies throughout the military. In 1948, 3 years after the war's conclusion, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. While many factors contributed to this historic decision, the demonstrated excellence of the Tuskegee Airmen had provided powerful evidence that segregation not only harmed those discriminated against, but deprived the nation of valuable talents and capabilities. Lieutenant James Harrison, by then a civilian pursuing a career in aeronautical engineering, was invited to the White House for the announcement. As he shook President Truman's hand, Harrison reflected on the journey from that first engagement above the Solomon Islands to this momentous policy change. "Your service made this possible," Truman told him quietly. "You and your men proved what should never have needed proving." Harrison nodded. "We were just doing our duty, Mr. President. We only wanted the chance to serve our country like anyone else." "You did more than serve," Truman replied. "You transformed our understanding of what service means." The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen extended far beyond their direct military contributions. They had demonstrated excellence in a field where many had predicted failure, developed innovations that influenced broader military doctrine, and in doing so, helped catalyze institutional changes that would eventually extend throughout American society. In 1955, Lieutenant Takeo Yoshida, now a civilian pilot for Japan Airlines, visited the United States as part of a commercial aviation delegation. During the visit, he had the unexpected opportunity to meet Captain Marcus Williams, who had become an airline pilot after the war, one of the first black pilots hired by a major American airline. The two former adversaries met at an aviation conference in Chicago, each immediately recognizing the other's name from combat reports they had filed a decade earlier. "Your squadron changed our tactical planning," Yoshida admitted as they shared coffee. "After our encounters, our entire approach to engaging American fighters had to be revised." Williams smiled. "We had no choice but to innovate. Standard tactics wouldn't work against the Zero's turning ability, so we had to develop new ones." "It was more than tactics," Yoshida observed thoughtfully. "Your unit fought with unusual determination. I could never quite explain it in my reports, but there was something different about engaging your aircraft." "We were fighting two wars," Williams explained after a moment's consideration. "One against Japan and another against perceptions back home. Every mission was a chance to prove what should never have needed proving." Yoshida nodded with understanding. "The most powerful motivation in combat is fighting for recognition of one's fundamental worth." This shared insight between former enemies highlighted the universal human desire for respect and recognition that had helped drive the Tuskegee Airmen to their historic achievements. By the 1960s, as the American civil rights movement gained momentum, the example of the Tuskegee Airmen provided a powerful precedent. They had demonstrated not just the capability to perform at the highest levels, but the capacity to innovate and lead when given the opportunity. Their legacy offered compelling evidence against arguments for continued segregation in any field. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced them in a speech at Howard University in 1965. "When our pilots flew against the most formidable fighters of the Japanese imperial forces, they not only held their own, they developed tactics that became standard for all American pilots. They demonstrated not just equality, but excellence. Their example reminds us that when artificial barriers are removed, extraordinary contributions become possible." The story of how black American pilots outflew Japanese Zeros and changed military doctrine represented more than just an interesting historical footnote. It illustrated a fundamental truth. Artificial barriers based on prejudice rather than ability not only harm those excluded, but deprive society of valuable contributions. Lieutenant Harrison's grandchildren would grow up in an America significantly different from the one he had known before the war, an America still imperfect and still struggling with the legacy of racism, but one where certain barriers had been irreversibly breached. They would have opportunities that their grandfather had needed to fight for both literally and figuratively. In his later years, when asked about his most significant contribution to American society, Harrison would reflect, We didn't set out to make history. We just wanted to fly planes and serve our country. But in being given that chance, and in exceeding even our own expectations, we helped change the narrative. The Japanese never expected black American pilots to outfly their Zeros. Many Americans never expected it either. But we did, and in doing so, we changed everything. This legacy continues to inspire new generations. The lesson of the Tuskegee Airmen remains relevant. Excellence is the most powerful refutation of prejudice, and when artificial barriers are removed, both individuals and society benefit from the full expression of human potential. The tactical innovations developed by those first black pilots to counter the Zero fighter became part of standard American air combat doctrine. Their success helped catalyze the desegregation of the American military, which in turn influenced broader social changes, and their example continues to inspire those facing similar barriers today, a reminder that performance can ultimately transcend prejudice. The Japanese pilots who first encountered them over the Solomon Islands never expected to face black American pilots in combat. They certainly never expected those pilots to outfly their vaunted Zeros. But they did, and in doing so they changed not just the tactical situation in that distant theater of war, but began a transformation that would eventually extend throughout American society. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.